Hello, and we are back today with another stream working on Daggerheart-compatible character classes. I had the impetus to work on these classes from something that is kind of leading into a home game for me, so I'm going to jump on that opportunity while my attention is on it and see if we can work on some of these classes. I am going to start today with the Herald, which is my class comprised of / in the domains of grace and splendor. The text here I have here says, Heralds bear the authority of a great power, enacting their will in the world. Heralds might serve a god, a titan, an archfey, or one of the faint divinities. They have an incredible force of will and bend public sentiment seemingly through their mere presence. Right, we've got the grace domain here, which in the core book includes the rogue class and the bard class. In the void classes, right, the warlock has is in the grace domain. That, of course, is just the void version. The final versions of warlock, witch, assassin, and brawler are all going to be in Hope and Fear, which was announced as coming out August 25th in a stream and posts that Darrington Press put out yesterday. Also, if you have not gone and looked at that video, there is a very full breakdown, cover reveal, unboxing of both editions of Hope and Fear, which is very cool. I continue to be absolutely staggered by the amazing art by both of those artists, and that is very fun and hype. I didn't have anything to do with the art part, so right on any of those really, in terms of the cover art. Hello to Woe Alessia. Thank you for following the channel. So, the Hope and Fear announcements, very cool. They said that they were going to do some like previews from the book, or it sounded like that's what they were going to do. So I'm interested to see what those are going to look like. And then if you're going to be at Gen Con, you might be able to get one of a few early release copies that they said that they would be bringing to the con. So that is exciting. I imagine that those versions of Hope and Fear will be one of the hot ticket items for RPG folks at Gen Con this year. But jumping back to our class here, as per usual, right? Let's see. Yeah, pointing down this way. This video is not official content of Darrington Press or Critical Role. Anything that I say here is just my own opinion. I'm not speaking on behalf of anybody else. These classes that I'm developing are not official classes. They're not going to be in the void because I'm developing them, not Darrington Press. But I was an additional designer on the Daggerheart core book. I've produced a lot of Daggerheart-compatible material, and so I hope folks will find what I'm working on interesting. If you want to see more of this text or the other Daggerheart-compatible classes I've been working on, you can do that by going over to my Patreon at patreon.com/MichaelRUnderwood. It's much easier for me to say it and then type it than do both at the same time, just because of how my brain works. So now that we've done this, we can get rid of that and just look at what I've got on the page here. So, domains, grace and splendor, sorted. Starting evasion, 10. Starting hit points, 5. Starting evasion of 10 is kind of the average to low average for evasion, right? Some of your classes like Rogue or Warrior are going to have higher evasion. Ranger also has higher evasion. The classes with the Valor domain often have lower evasion, right? Because they're more about taking damage than avoiding getting hit. The Heralds, I think, should be on the squishier side, which is why we're looking at a starting HP of 5, and they may end up being one of the more non-combat focused classes, though because of the game Daggerheart, the way that the kind of game that Daggerheart is, even the Herald is going to end up with some combat oriented or combat ready features, because if they didn't, we could have the situation where a Herald character felt like they didn't really have anything to do during a combat scene, and a lot of Daggerheart games are going to focus on or have a lot of combat. If we look at the way that the core rulebook is written, it talks about Daggerheart being like a major element of play. So even though I like the idea of a class that's more focused on the social and the interpersonal, we're going to want to give them some combat ready or combat oriented features so that they can be playing the same game as anybody else. Hello, Elliot Jackson. All right, if we look down here, we've got a couple of other things already for the Herald. We've got a class item choice of a book of sacred literature or an ornate bell. And right now, of course, this is all work in progress, we have a hope feature called awe-inspiring. Spend 3 hope to make a presence roll against all targets within far range. Any targets you succeed against must mark a stress. A couple of things that are important to note here. This is all targets, not all creatures. So if you're with your party, you're not making like a presence attack against them, right? You choose any number of targets within far range. So if you had a Herald character who was like speaking to an assembled populace in a city, in a city square or something, right? There might be a couple of hundred people within far range, and if the Herald character was trying to kind of overawe that crowd, you'd make this presence roll and then apply it to any or all of those targets. If I were GMing a Herald in this kind of situation, I would probably mentally flag like, okay, the crowd is all a horde type adversary or horde and social, or I would just have the Herald rolling against the environment difficulty for the city square. And then if they succeeded, and I'm using this as an environment, instead of marking a stress, I'm going to use the idea of the Herald having this awe-inspiring or this kind of majestic impact as then going to be something that shifts the environment, right? If I can't have the mechanical effect, but I am representing people, where often individual people are going to have stress that they would then mark, and I'm the GM, I want to follow the fiction, think about what this kind of ability is, keep the mechanical impact in mind, and then try to close that loop in how I resolve or narrate what happens within the scene, right? If the mechanics don't automatically give me something that applies to how I am mechanically managing a scene, I'm going to try and create some manifestation that makes good on what the player characters have done, especially a hope feature where the PC has just spent 3 hope to do something big. Awe-inspiring could be used in a fight scene, right? The Herald is in a scene with maybe 2 hordes of enemies and a bruiser, a skulk, and a leader type. Okay, well that's 5 enemy stat blocks to roll against. And so the Herald could do 5 stress, 1 each to those 5 different adversaries, right? The 2 hordes each represented as 1 adversary stat block. Hello, Adventure Lies Ahead. Happy lurking. So what I like about this already is that it gives the Herald this ability to be kind of a broadly impacting social character. Whereas if we look at the Bard and the Rogue hope features, the Bard Rogue feature distracts and reduces the difficulty of one particular enemy, whereas the awe-inspiring feature puts out stress against potentially a bunch of different enemies. Could we have an alternate version of a Bard that does have that broad impact? Absolutely. And many times, or a lot of the time, when a Bard character is performing or trying to make probably presence rolls to have a social impact within a scene, we're going to have some capabilities along those lines. But one of the things that I'm going to be thinking about while working on the Herald class is, how is this class different from the way that bards are designed or the way that rogues are designed? And right now, because the classes that are forthcoming in Hope and Fear are not in the SRD, I just kind of put them all to the side and I don't think about them. Right? I'm not designing something that goes alongside the Warlock. The Warlock is going to come and sit alongside the Bard and the Rogue, and I am building something to sit alongside the Bard and the Rogue, and then we'll see what happens. And again, this is because I'm designing stuff with the expectation that is going to be sold rather than just being homebrew that I share for free, right? That's the kind of the big difference for me. As you can see here, and I'm going to scroll down a little bit, we've got 2 class features in this draft right now. Divine Edicts is the first one. Your pronouncements carry the weight of divinity. Once per session, you may mark a stress, right? Mark a stress, we bold it because it's a cost. Mark a stress and make a proclamation governing how all present must act. All targets within far range, right? Again, so we have some synchronicity in how the features work. So the Herald is very much a kind of anybody within earshot, right? The Herald is speaking or addressing groups. All targets within far range must make a reaction roll, difficulty equal to 10 plus your presence trait, right? So for a first level Herald, that's probably going to be a 12 because presence is going to be the spellcast trait, and they're probably going to have other +2 in that. And then a tier 4 Herald will probably have a presence trait of 5, possibly a 6 if they have like a relic or something that increases their trait, because increasing your traits is very difficult in Daggerheart outside of your standard progression, and that progression is metered in such a way that you don't end up with like super disparate stats all at once. You can't take your 2 level advancements when you go from level 1 to level 2 and go, cool, my presence goes from 2 to 3 to 4, right? You have that trait marking element in how advancement works. And that keeps the traits kind of more likely to rise together, as opposed to a character just putting everything into one trait, because you really can't. So that's the reaction roll. Notably, this is a reaction roll written with the expectation that it's mostly going to be made by NPCs, right? Because a reaction roll for a player character is going to tell you what trait is involved. When I'm writing player features that require reaction rolls, I'm generally going to default to the expectation that it's an NPC that's making this roll. That is the structure as seen in the core rulebook, where we have class features that require reaction rolls and things like that. And I think that a lot of GMs in many situations will be able to look at the fiction and the mechanics of a feature and then decide what trait to use if a player character ends up actually needing to make that reaction roll as well, right? With the fireball spell in Codex, which is in one of the grimoires, because fireball says all creatures, right? You can have friendly fire. What is it going to take to get out of the way of a fireball? It might be instinct to see it coming. It might be agility to get out of the way in time, right? And then any given GM would adjudicate it based on their judgment and based on following the fiction, right? We begin and end with the fiction. So for Divine Edicts, until the end of the scene, any target that failed this reaction roll must mark a stress to disobey the edict. So, example, a herald comes into a square, into a town square and says, let's say, let's go ahead and do some product synergy and say we have a herald of Chore, right? Goddess of freedom and revolution from Bastion of Hope. She walks into a square in the Marrow Plains, right, in a city in the Marrow Plains, and says, right, Choray's blessings be with you. Rise up against your oppressors. Take this city from them and show the Marrow Queen what it means to be free. If that's the proclamation, the thing that's being said is, I want you to rise up. If you don't do this, you will mark stress. That is a pretty aggressive move from that herald. Another thing the herald could do is they're in the square and they're talking about how the people of the Marrow Plains should rise up against the Marrow Queen and all the things that she does to oppress them. And then the divine edict that she gives is all those that serve the Marrow Queen must lay down their arms and step aside. Then the 20-something guards coming in, maybe it's, 2 hordes of guards, and the player character who is the herald is doing their propaganda, and the GM is describing these guards coming closer. And then the herald says, I'm going to use divine edicts. My proclamation is all those who serve the Marrow Queen must lay down their arms and leave. The guards then have to make the reaction roll, and if they fail, they have to mark a stress to disobey the edict. Now, this is only until the end of the scene. There is some question about how often someone should have to mark a stress, right? Until the end of the scene, any target that failed must mark a stress to disobey the edict, right? Is this each time they disobey the edict? How do we judge that? The simplest thing is that it's a one and done. That still lets the herald put this social pressure with mechanical weight of marking a stress onto potentially a large group of people, and we know that the herald already has an ability to make people mark stress. So if a herald opened with awe-inspiring as they were giving their speech about Choray and the Marrow Queen and succeeded against those guards, they make the guards mark a stress. If they then put down a divine edict and make those guards mark a stress again, how many stress did those guards have to begin with? The herald then is a character who, with a stress-oriented build, which you can definitely support using the grace domain, it's not going to be the only way to go about things, but it's certainly an option you have. Having a herald in your group means that you're going to have a broader and deeper toolkit for making adversaries have to mark stress until they are vulnerable, because a creature that has all of their stress marked is vulnerable until they clear stress. Right? You're exhausted, you're worn out, your willpower is drained. So if the herald is doing that while the other characters are fighting, the herald is making the fight easier for everybody around them and all of their allies because of their overpowering presence and their ability to kind of batter at the will of those who stand against their gods' proclamations. And then we have a little bit of a ribbon feature here in Hallowed Senses. You can detect and identify the workings of divine beings within a far range. This I see as sort of a divine parallel to the kind of broad-based magical senses for the sorcerer class, but it is a bit narrower. I would say that it could be used more, could give more of an advantage or more information because it says detect and identify. So in a scene where a herald is traveling with a party into a tomb, I might say, Herald, your divine senses pick up the trace of a powerful but very absent god. And then the Herald character might say, like, oh, well, can I identify who that is through my hallowed senses? Fictionally, the way that the hallowed senses operate would put that Herald character in a good position to be able to not just identify that there is divine magic or divine working or some divine being, but also who it is, right? If you're a Herald, it's really important you know who you're talking to. And so that makes sense to me as a way for a Herald character to be more effective, especially in a world where your Herald's god is has to maintain relationships with all these other divine beings, right? You don't want to step on their toes if you can avoid it. Hello, Ed and Entertainment. Ed and Entertainment says, interesting class design. I picture them with a blessed megaphone. Hello, Woalesia. Woalesia says, first time catching these live streams. Really great info about class designing. Thank you so much, and thank you for being here. And again, all of these thoughts on class design are just how I approach things. If you are interested in doing class design for use with the Daggerheart rules or Daggerheart-compatible class design, definitely also check out the homebrew kit. I was one of the writers of that homebrew kit, but anything that's said in there is more official versus the things that I'm saying here are just on my own behalf. And Daggerheart is the kind of game that you make your own, so I'm pretty sure, though I cannot speak for Darrington, I don't think anybody at Darrington is going to kick down your door and say that you are making or running your homebrew classes wrong if you are just using them at your private table, right? If you're publishing them, then the community gaming license is a thing, and that's separate. So we've got a pretty broad class feature here in Divine Edicts. I think that there's the potential to want to go maybe deeper with this, because if we compare these Herald class abilities to some other class features, some players might think that the Divine Edicts are a little bit soft or are a little bit underpowered. My note that I have to myself here is on Divine Edicts is this too strong? I want something that scales but isn't too OP. I could see a version here where if this feature needed to become more powerful, any target that failed this reaction roll is vulnerable or becomes temporarily vulnerable if and when they disobey the edict. Making them instantly but temporarily vulnerable is going to have a really pronounced impact on the scene. I could also say that until the end of the scene, any target that failed this reaction roll must mark a stress whenever they disobey the edict. In that case, if we go back to our example with the Herald in Bastion of Hope, the Herald says, all those that serve the Marrow Queen must lay down their arms. We make the roll, they don't do it. If those soldiers move forward and kind of presented the arms to threaten the Herald, I would say that's probably going to require them to mark another stress. The thing that's trickier here is I would not want this feature to be hard for a GM to interpret and adjudicate. Because it is a bit more broad and social in how it is designed, there can be the potential for murkiness or a lack of clarity. There's a couple of ways of addressing that. One is the GM working with the player of a Herald saying, when you make these proclamations, you need to make them in such a way that it's easy to tell when someone is violating it, right? You have to set specific interdictions that are then easier for the GM to adjudicate. This represents violating the Divine Edict. That represents violating the Divine Edict. So the Herald might say, all those that serve the Marrow Queen must leave this, must kind of leave this, leave the settlement, leave the square, right? That is a one-off thing. What's the version where they're going to have to make the roll again and again, right? Agents of the Marrow Queen shall not use violence against those that resist her. If that was the interdiction or the divine edict, then any time somebody who had failed that roll made an attack against the Herald or other people who are rebelling, that would require them to mark a stress. So that is the kind of edict that is easier to adjudicate and know every single time when they should have to mark a stress. That version of the feature is very powerful, because while the target can potentially succeed on the reaction roll, in a lot of situations, you're going to be able to make a number of adversaries make this reaction roll. And so in a big kind of set piece scene, it's several different people. And this reaction roll is going to be pretty difficult, because it's going to scale probably from about difficulty 12 to difficulty 15 or 16. A difficulty 15 reaction roll is about, that's a 30% chance of success without any bonuses, because you're rolling your d20 when it's the GM rolling reaction rolls for adversaries or NPCs. Hello, Jota. So that's pretty strong. What I'm thinking for now is, because this is something that I already have written and I want to move on to creating some new elements and not just talking through what I have, we're going to leave Divine Edicts and Hallowed Senses where they are. Thank you very much, Jota Pe Carvuja, for subscribing with Prime. 4 months is a lot of support, and I really appreciate it. So this is where I start. Basically, this is where I've left off, is subclasses. I have ideas about what the subclasses theme or vibe should be, but I haven't really started building the features for them. And what I want to do today is I want to fill out at least one subclass, and I would like to write some, if not all, of my background and connection questions. This is because I want to play a Herald in a game that we're doing a session 0 for tonight. And if I can have all these done, that makes it much easier. We could kind of hand wave our way through some of these, and because I'm the designer of this class, I could then just take those down as notes, but I'd rather have more stuff actually settled. The last little bits that would be good would be to come up with a pick list each for clothes that are and attitude like A. These are elements on the second page or the character info sheet for each class. And you'll note, if you look through those sheets for every one of the core classes in the Daggerheart core book, the clothes that are and attitude like A sections are different for each class. So that's kind of laying the groundwork here of what we're trying to cover. Right now I have the names of my subclasses as Archon and Majestic. For Archon, I have pronouncements / interdictions, magical bindings, right? So that would probably be building on the Divine Edicts feature in that way. And then the Majestic subclass, I just have my notes as awe / stun. So what we could do here is the Majestic class could be more the dealing stress stun oriented build, and then the Archon could be more about specifics or digging in with those Divine Edicts, right? If I go and look at Archon, right? Archon is a Greek word that, according to the translations that I've seen, means ruler, right? So it's a title of public office. I've also seen Archon, like the kinds of things that get called archons are like judges or rulers or arbiters, administrators, right? So for me, an archon is more about the process of implementation and execution of divine mandates, divine edicts. And the majestic is maybe more the subclass that is about shaking people out of whatever paradigm they're in. It is more about overawing the opponents of the herald, right? That a majestic herald is the one that you send to a god's foes, saying, lay down your weapons or be destroyed. The archon is the herald that you send to the city on the border with those enemies, where that herald is coordinating, organizing, and supporting the people of the city that are already loyal to the god, right? I'm trying to spin out thoughts about the differences between these subclasses here. I think they will both be spellcast. They will both use presence as their spellcast trait. I could see a world where maybe the Archon used knowledge instead, but I don't know that I necessarily want to go with that. So let's start with the Archon. So at a baseline, right, we need a spellcast trait. So we've got that. And, right, we want to say play the Archon if you wish to manifest your divinities will among the people spreading and executing their laws. What that makes me think about is something like going back up to divine edicts. What if maybe a Archon can do more divine edicts, or the divine edicts that they issue are more powerful? So we could go down here to foundation feature and say, divine code, right? Kind of like code of laws, Hammurabi's code. I always end up tweaking names of various features while I'm doing design because I'm reframing and polishing things in my mind. You can use your divine proclamation feature once per scene. Right? So divine edicts, I used the wrong name. Divine Edict says once per session. Divine Arbiter would say you can use your Divine Edicts feature once per scene. The trick here is that this is something that the Herald character does not roll, right? You mark a stress, and then people make a reaction roll. That means that whether they are affected is impacted more by... They're the ones who get to make the roll. And as I think about it, I wonder if I don't want this to be something where the herald is rolling. The trick there is then I would have both the hope feature and a class feature that would say make a presence roll. And I don't know that I necessarily want that. We could say that awe-inspiring becomes spend 3 hope to force all targets within far range to make a reaction roll or mark a stress. And then the divine edicts, which is probably the thing that the player character is going to roll more frequently, is the thing that takes the presence role. That way, the hope feature is more powerful under there is a way in which the hope feature is more powerful because you don't have to roll as the player character. You spend 3 hope and that you've done what you need to do. Only then can the GM spend resources to utilize an experience for a reaction roll or put their thumb on the scale on the back end versus putting their thumb on the scale on the front end. Though you can utilize an experience to increase the difficulty of an adversary, which is a thing that I do sometimes, but not super often. So I already have a draft of this as is. So let's say so this is, I'm going to change this. Make a presence roll. Roll against any number of targets and sorry, this is going to be make your proclamation of what action must be taken and make a presence roll against any number of targets within far range. On a success, once per session, mark a stress and yada, yada, yada. Hello, Prince Justin, who's at work, but fascinating listening to this. Oh, cool. Playtesting a new frame. That is very fun. Yeah, I think we'll probably see Daggerheart stuff flitting around on people's minds in the next couple of weeks, and then probably again in August when Hope and Fear releases, because they'll be, it'll be kind of in the news. Things like that. So we do this. We say mark a stress. On a success, once per session, mark a stress to make all targets you succeeded against temporarily bound. A bound target marks a stress each time they violate the proclamation, terms of the proclamation. So what does this do? This is a different implementation of the same idea. What this means is that the Herald does not have to mark a stress unless they succeed against somebody, right? So that if they try to do a high roller and say, I want to give a divine edict to the king, and they roll and they don't succeed, there's going to be consequences for that anyway. They don't have to mark a stress. But if they do succeed against somebody and they want to exert that will, then they mark a stress. I don't want to make it mark a stress for each target because that's going to add up too much. And I do like the idea of the Herald having this kind of broad social capability. What we do is we give them a temporary status, which is a thing that happens a fair amount in Daggerheart. Adversaries get statuses, and most of the time when they get a status, it is a temporary status. What that means is that the GM can spend fear to clear that status for a target. But the GM is encouraged to not clear a status immediately so that whatever that status is can have an impact in the scene at least one notable time. Because the divine edicts can be used really broadly, if the GM spends a fear for each target that failed, that gets expensive really quickly. So they are going to be more likely to save their fear and just spend it for the more prominent or more important adversaries, or the adversaries who are going to be taking action against this proclamation more frequently. And that gives that Herald the feeling like they're having a bigger impact on the scene, especially because this is a once per session ability. Entertainment says, I like that change. It cleans up a lot. What action must be taken, and giving it a condition is good to let the GM spend that fear. Thank you. Right? This is one of the things that's in the Daggerheart homebrew kit is streamline and then streamline again. For me, this was streamlining in that I saw this earlier draft as being like, oh, okay, this is a little unclear. So we're revising so that it runs more smoothly. And the way that this is built gives spaces for subclass features to push in different directions. Now, going along with that, I'm going to jump up and change awe-inspiring. Force all targets within far range to make a reaction roll 13 or mark a stress. What I've done here is I've simplified how awe-inspiring works. Instead of having this variable difficulty on the reaction roll, I've just given it a difficulty of 13. Getting a 13 plus, right? So a 10 is a 55% chance. Needing an 11 is 50. Needing a 12 is 45. Needing a 13 is a 40% chance of success. And that's without any bonuses. So you go into a room, you use awe-inspiring, and 60% of the adversaries in the room are going to have to mark a stress. Maybe I'll end up wanting to tweak that number up. Maybe I'll tweak it down. Maybe I will go back and have that number impacted by the character's presence. If I can just set one number and have it be effective throughout a campaign, that's going to be better because that is more streamlined. It is a smoother, easier thing to implement. The nice thing here is that for the player, they spend the 3 hope, and then they just do the thing, right? For a hope feature, I might say, describe how their divine presence manifests and force all targets within far range to make a presence reaction roll, right? I want to have some explicit indication of the fiction in the hope feature, and I'm doing it in a way that doesn't add too much in the way of word count. So now, with our revised divine edicts, let's go back down to the Archon. Right, so this is a presence roll against any number of targets, and then we have this status of bound. What I can do with this is I could say you can use your divine edicts feature once per scene. So instead of the edicts feature having more of an impact when it's used, it can be used more frequently. Once per scene is a lot more often. I could change it to once per rest. Depending on your sessions, once per rest and once per session might be close to the same. Once per scene is almost always going to be more frequently than once per session. Let's see. Just thinking about how I want this to apply. Okay. All right. So another feature here, right? Because Divine Arbiter on its own it does a lot because you can use this thing more frequently, but that feature doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily more powerful as at a baseline, but we can also have another foundation feature, especially because Divine Arbiter was really short in terms of the text, right? Set an example. When you lead a group of people in pursuit of your god's dictates or tenets. Right, so it's when you do a thing that a herald is going to want to do, you're going to get to do it better, right? You may spend a hope to, and now I'm going to have a drink of water while I think. Add your tier to the result after rolling the dice, but before the result is determined. I'm going to go back and change the wording on this before this is published, because there is specific wording in some features that are, you can do this after you've rolled the dice, but before you know the result of the roll. So what this will let me do, right, is I'm a level 2 herald, and I am leading a group of villagers to build like fortifications against oncoming attackers from the Marrow Queen's forces. I say, I want to kind of inspire and direct the people of this town to build these fortifications, right? I'm going to kind of bolster and encourage them. The GM says, great, go ahead and make a presence roll. I make my presence roll, and I go, okay, well, I know that the difficulty of this environment is 14 because we've made other rolls and in this environment of the town. And I got a 13 on my roll. So I'm going to spend of hope and set an example, adding my tier of 2 to this roll, making it a 16. So this is a get to add a bonus after you roll, which makes it more powerful as opposed to adding a bonus before you roll. Because if I was adding my tier before my roll, it would be less useful in most cases than just utilizing an experience. So for this to be a useful subclass feature, it's going to need to probably be comparable to or more or preferable to just using an experience. And what this does is it lets a herald character be more confident that they're going to be able to lead a group of people to do a thing, right? So this is establishing the Archon character as a leader of people, not just a messenger of the god, but they bring that god's will into reality, but in a way that's really different from something like a seraph, right? A seraph is a divine protector and warrior. Their class feature of the prayer dice can assist at a distance, and that can assist later on, but it is the prayer dice feature is very strong, to be clear, and that's a class feature, not a subclass feature. But you get a finite number of prayer dice per session, right? And so that's a limitation on that ability. You cannot divide up the bonus from a prayer die. Set an example you can use on any given roll as long as you have a hope. Now, should this be mark a stress instead? I think so. Mark a stress means that using your stress pool means you have 6 of those to spend, but you don't regain stress as frequently as you regain hope. For me, in something like this, spend a hope is a more overtly magical feature. Mark a stress is more your own personal force of will is the thing that's making this happen. And the set an example version that calls for marking stress, to me, centers the kind of personness of the Herald, right? That they are in the world making this happen. It also makes the class overall a little bit less hope dependent, though maybe we want it to be kind of a hope focused class, because the Grace domain has some ways of regaining hope. It's not going to be, the Herald is not going to be as good at that as the Troubadour Bard, because the Troubadour Bard has a foundation feature that's about regaining hope. But maybe we give the Herald a feature later on that will regain some hope, right? And so so for a specialization feature, we could have something called Congregate. You gain access to a new downtime move called Congregate. And then when you congregate, all allies within that can be used once per rest. Describe how you lead a inspire and your allies to bolster their spirits. All targets within close gain a hope and clear a stress. So what this does is it means that the Herald character has this more efficient, more flexible downtime option, because in a short rest, right, you get 2 downtime actions. You get 2 downtime actions in a long rest as well, but when you take a long rest, you clear all stress, marked HP, or marked armor slots. On a short rest, right, you roll that 1d4 and you add your tier. If you have a Herald in your party and you have a couple of people who have 1 or 2 stress marked, but they need hope, or they've marked more hit points, they've marked armor, the Herald using Congregate means that those characters that have marked 1 or 2 stress can clear some of that stress without having to spend downtime actions of their own. So again, this makes the Herald a very group-oriented character. It gives somebody who is playing a Herald kind of a baseline or an automatic thing to do during a rest, which is assemble the people and bolster their spirits. A Herald character can still do a prepare action with 1 other PC where you both gain 2 hope, and that may be more beneficial to the Herald character, because with Congregate, you gain 1 hope and you clear 1 stress. I probably didn't want Congregate to be usable for both of your actions during a downtime, because it might end up being too much resource generation. I'm going to have the text go like this. This is a decent amount of text here, so I don't know that I want to necessarily add another feature. The thing I would eventually do with this is I would input this text into the card creator on Daggerheart.com and see kind of how much space that actually leaves me, trying to stay within those bounds of simplify and streamline the language so that it's easy to parse and it can fit onto those cards. Now the mastery feature should be pretty big. It's mastery, right? You have to spend several upgrades, several of your level advancements to get all the way up to a mastery. Congregate might end up still being a little weak, a little soft. Something I'm going to do for Majestic. Something that came to mind for me is that one of the Majestics features should be something that requires the GM to spend 2 fear to clear bound instead of 1, right? To make the bindings of those divine edicts harder to shake off. Okay. Actually, here's something. When a bound target So this is a more explicitly combat feature, which I wanted the class to have. Something like the Troubadour Bard or the Wordsmith Bard, they have features that can be really socially oriented, but are grounded in the mechanics of the game so that they can be combat applicable, because having hope, clearing stress, those kinds of things are always relevant in a combat, because it's the baseline kind of grammar of play, right? These are the resources that you are depleting, you are using, gaining, so on and so forth. But weighty words, I had originally thought as maybe being when you succeed against a bound target, you make them mark basically an additional stress, or you make them mark another stress. But I wanted to try out something that is more explicitly combat oriented. Well, Alessia has a question. Quote, a question about class design. In your personal opinion, if a class has 1 primary domain and let's say 2 secondary domains which you have to choose from when you create your character, do you think that would break the class design? The short answer is yes. The longer answer is that is not necessarily in what I take to be the design intent of how class design works in Daggerheart. But if that is an idea that is exciting for you, I think you can follow it. What I might suggest there is, do you have the secondary domain, as you call it? Because in Daggerheart, as I understand it, each class does not have a primary and secondary domain. They exist in the intersection of 2 domains. We might look at some of those classes and make an argument, but I don't think the game itself makes that argument. So if you did want to have like primary, secondary domains, what you might do is you would say that this class is X domain and then a second domain depending on your subclass. And so you could have subclass A that uses the first of these domain choices and subclass B, which uses the second of those domain choices. That would let you have the thematic and mechanical identity be more coherent within these 2 versions of the character class, right? It becomes easier to say, this is what this version of the class looks like, because you bind it and associate it with the specific subclass. So if I was given the task of designing classes in that fashion, that's probably how I would approach it, with those caveats that I've indicated. Jote Corvuja says, I think saying a class has a primary domain implies that those domain cards are more important to the class. I would agree with that assessment, which is, again, part of why I would not on my own lean toward that type of design approach, but I'm not going to say people can't do that. But those are my thoughts on that kind of approach and how I think it would work most effectively if you were going to go ahead and make that choice. Okay. Let's tweak these so that they look a little bit bigger. Spellcast trait. I just like it to look a particular way. So we got our weighty words, we've got congregate. The specialization is maybe a little bit long on wordiness, but that is not something we have to fix today, right? This is very much a work in progress. I could probably move on already because I don't know that I need a mastery feature to start playtesting tonight. So I'm going to jump down to background questions because sometimes those can take a good bit of work. You bore witness to a great wrongdoing as a child. Not as a child. Let's loosen this up a bit. And swore to see that something like that right? With these background questions, we want to try to stay concise as much as we can. What was it and how did that lead you to your divine right? This might be two questions, right? Because in reality it is, right? What was this wrongdoing and how did it lead you to the divinity? But we're going to move forward. Your status as a herald has brought you much closer to the people of one settlement in particular. What is it and who among them has become an unexpected ally? I especially like unexpected here because it lets the player and the GM come together to create an NPC with whom or for whom the player character's relationship is not necessarily automatically simple, but we are establishing that they are an ally. So it creates an NPC-PC relationship that hopefully is a little bit more charged from the beginning, maybe a little bit complicated, and it gives something where that NPC kind of can stand for or represent that settlement or community. And the Herald character is going to, interacting with that NPC, also be thinking about the community by proxy, right? It creates a little bit of potential complexity and meatiness in terms of narrative interactions. Jumbo Chicken, welcome to the chat. The question asks, how do you approach playtesting or stress testing homebrewed content? How do you approach the players or table? What are the key things you want to check out, take away from, what to iterate on, or what is solid already? Great questions that would definitely could be their own stream, could be a whole stream on their own. The way I have approached playtesting these classes has been to treat them like they are any other class. Right? I have a playtest game that has gotten started a few weeks ago where everybody is playing one of these custom classes that I've made. And I've tried to just run it like Daggerheart and then get feedback from the players about how they feel about the class features, about the background and connection questions when we were doing those in session 0, and keep an eye on whether I feel like what I have written allows these players to express their characters, express class identity, and to have that flexibility where I see the class stuff is happening, the subclass stuff is happening, and that the individual character is getting to be expressed, and that they emerge from, but also go beyond the identity of the class or the subclass. Playtesting adversaries is very different in some ways and not different in others, right? When I playtest adversaries, I just use them. Most of my playtesting I try to do in as organic a context I can by playing and running the game, and then some of the time I'm using something that I've created. For me, the boundary between improvisation, homebrew, and third-party design is more porous because of my specific experience with and position with regards to the game, right? Because I worked on the game and was an additional designer, the things I make are not automatically more official, but I can be confident that they come from and are informed by my experience. In general, what I have found is that when I'm playtesting, I want to see something in action, experience what it's like in practice, and then reflect upon it to see whether it is accomplishing what I wanted it to. And then when I either think that it isn't doing what I want it to, or when I think it could be done better, I then return to the mechanical elements or to the writing and reframe or revise toward what I think is the best implementation of the idea. But for me, I want to solicit feedback from the people who are playing the class or interacting with the adversaries. I want to create as organic an experience as possible so that it feels like Daggerheart, and that I reduce or isolate the variables of this is a more artificial situation, so that I can just focus on how is this working as a X when I already have experience or knowledge of other X's, classes, adversaries, so on and so forth, within how Daggerheart operates. That's the short version. How to playtest would be a fun session or a fun stream in the future, for sure. Greatest foe. Right, so third background question. Who is your divinity's greatest foe? That's the baseline, right? It's going to be some other divinity or something like that. And foe. You have faced one of their heralds in the past. No, let's go back to this. Just foe. And what champion or messenger of theirs has thwarted your efforts in the past? What I'm doing here is we're basically we're setting up a campaign level rival or antagonist in the foe, and then a shorter term or more personal antagonist in the champion or messenger, right? So you could have my god and I'm a herald, and then you could have another god and their herald, and you could be more like social adversaries. But writing it in this way, right? I could even collapse this down to representative, but I wanted to have the more clear guidance of champion or messenger, right? It's not necessarily somebody who has the same type of powers, but it absolutely could be. So then looking back here, this question is very much an origin story question. How did you become a herald? And it means that heralds all emerge from bearing witness to a great wrongdoing and wanting to keep it from happening again. So that heralds are about being in the world, keeping bad things from happening. That's a bit of class identity that I want to kind of roll with for now, at least. What I'm going to have to do is go and check these questions against my questions for the champion class, which is my other divine-oriented Splendor Domain class that I've been building. And I want to make sure that the questions are not too similar. And I'm going to double-check these questions against those from the Seraph class in the SRD. But moving forward, since we're coming up on an hour and a half here, is connection questions. Why are you the... Okay, so these are personal, they're interpersonal. What of ethics or leadership do we always find ourselves arguing about? Right? This makes the Herald a little bit more of an intellectual. It's also emphasizing this element of leadership. Why do you most I want something that's about the Herald kind of wanting the approval of this other character, right? Why do I always look to you when when delivering divine edicts? If I frame it this way, it is a looser framing, right? Why do I always look to you when delivering divine edicts? That could be, I want your approval. It could be because I know I need to make you do this too, but you don't have to do it that way. There's some flexibility in that. Jota asks, have you attempted to make a domain? I would love a stream about that, but I know it's a harder aspect to homebrew for Daggerheart. I have not made a third-party domain yet. I have brainstormed themes of domains for a kind of Daggerheart mech game that would have a whole new set of domains, but some of those domains might overlap broadly with Daggerheart domains, right? I think one of my domains for this mech game that I had was Claw, and that Claw domain might end up overlapping a lot with the Blade domain. But my idea here, and this is just like a preview, is that the class of mech is the character class, right? Oh yeah, this is a raptor class mech, which has the claw and wing domains. And that means that it's a mech that is about melee and flight/maneuverability, right? That's the raptor class. And then I might have a domain that's bombard, which is all about like missiles and ranged weapons or like support from range. And then if I have bombard and wing and the wing domain, bombard and wing, that's like maybe, if it wasn't already in Daggerheart, right, that would be like the Seraph class mech. Right, maybe it's an angel class mech or something like that. Hello, Dr. Claw MD. Yes, Daggerheart mech game is on my long list of projects. I'm not really able to do much with any of those other bigger projects until I'm done with Drakenheim, just because I don't have that much mental bandwidth. But it is something I want to get back to. I'm glad that you're excited about it. All right. Let's try to get these written so that I have something to use tonight. Why do I always look to you when delivering divine edicts? What leader from your community do I remind you of, and why? All right, so these questions and this other stuff is focusing a lot on this leadership quality. I have the commander class who is also a leader. I don't know that I think that that's necessarily a problem. A lot of different characters can end up being leaders. That might mean that I want to back off some of this on the Herald, because to what degree do I want to tell somebody who's playing a Herald, you automatically have to be a leader? But if these are supplemental, optional, Daggerheart-compatible classes, I'm not telling somebody this is the only way to be a leader, right? These are not core classes. They are things that somebody's going to opt into. And I think an upside of Daggerheart and where Daggerheart is and designing for it is that, I mean, there's already dozens of custom third-party created classes that are out there. Even more if we look at stuff that's more technically homebrew, because, you know, maybe people are using the Dread domain, which is not in the CGL, and so they're just sharing their homebrew kind of outside of the official paid publication version, right? This is all just my understanding of the CGL. I'm not a lawyer. There's a lot of different things that people have created to add to Daggerheart, right? Daggerheart has these 9 classes from the core book, and then we're going to have 4 more classes from Hope and Fear, as we are told. So that's 13. I have like 10 custom classes in various degrees of doneness already on my own, right? I could, if I really wanted to, probably release as many new custom classes as there are officially published Darrington classes within the next year. I don't necessarily want to do that just to do it, and I'm aware of the danger of like decision paralysis and having too many different options. So I'm flagging this as something to keep an eye on for myself, but I think I'm okay. Thank you, Dr. Claw MD. Will Alessia says, in one of the Daggerheart official videos, they said that they won't design a new domain unless it's something that fits at least 2 or more classes, and designing the domain along with the 2 classes takes a lot of time. Yeah, that is, it matches my experience, and if this is coming from Spencer and Rowan and from Darrington specifically, that's the single source of truth. My individual experience of developing classes or domains may be different, right? I've been developing new classes using existing domains for all of these third-party classes. So it's a little bit of a different experience. If I were to design a new domain, I probably would take that same approach of this needs to have classes, right? This domain isn't going to exist in a vacuum. I need some classes to bring it to life, or some classes where that domain can then intersect with another class and I can have a feeling about how they work together. Clothes that are ornate, ostentatious, brand new, this does not need to be in 14-point font. Attitude like a preacher, like a courier, like a... Do I have judge? I think I probably have judge somewhere else. But I'm just going to do it here. We're going to have these be alphabetical. Preacher... attitude like a courier, like a diplomat, like a judge, like a preacher. All right, that's 4 options. 4 options for clothes would probably also be good. Clothes that are brand new, clothes that are intricate, clothes that are ostentatious, clothes that are Herald, right? Ostentatious kind of covers flashy, which is another word that comes to mind. Let's go against type. Clothes that are humble, right? So you might be a herald with humble clothes. And then that's the start of my write-up for the cursed class. Okay, we are at just about an hour and a half. We have one almost full subclass in the Archon. And we've revised our hope and class features. So I think that is going to be a stream for today. I will probably keep working on this. My hope is to use it in a campaign that's getting started tonight. If I get to do that, I will get to playtest this a lot, and that'll be really fun. If I end up playing a different kind of character, maybe I'll use one of my other classes, and then I can report back on this and continue to update these class work in progress documents. Thank you all for hanging out and chatting. Thanks for your questions and your suggestions. Shoutouts to Dr. Claw MD, Woe Alessia, Jota Pe Corvuja, Jumbo Chicken, Etten Entertainment, Prince Justin, Adventure Lies Ahead 1, N. Esman, Elliot Jackson, and everybody else who is lurking, anybody who is watching on VOD over on Twitch or on YouTube. If you have questions about things from this video, the best place to ask them is over in the comments on the YouTube. That is going to be that. I will have some news about Bastion of Hope for you, I think, probably pretty soon, but nothing that I can give you just yet. Also, if you have not already, I don't know if it's out by now, but probably by the time anybody who's watching this on VOD watches it, Volume 2 of Pistol Heart by my friend and colleague Carlos Cisco is going to be out probably on Itch, Heart of Daggers, and or Drive-Thru RPG. If you have not, out right now, thank you very much, Cat Vampire. So you should go and get it. Part 2 of Carlos's kind of modular series of fantasy Western supplements for use with the Daggerheart rules. This volume number 2 has some really cool different stuff that is usable broadly outside of the Western genre. So go check it out. All right. Thank you, Cat Vampire, and take care, everybody. See you next time.